Hi everyone, so this series of lessons is going to focus on the Elizabethan module running from 1580 to 1603. So our first chapter is looking at how Elizabeth used her power. So as you can see in the image, you can see how Elizabeth's getting attention. She looks sort of sat upright, she looks young, she's got a silk dress on that's very expensive. Lots of precious gems. She's been lifted above everybody else. The sun is shining on her, and paintings like this were designed to show her sort of perfection and popularity and her power amongst the people. So sort of a big question that we look at in this module is, was Elizabeth a bully and a show-off? So this section is set into three: Elizabeth and her court, Elizabeth and her parliament, and Elizabeth and her people. So if we start off with Elizabeth and her court, Elizabeth ran her government through patronage. So power came from the top down, as you can see in the hierarchy on the right hand side. God grants power and status to the monarch, the queen, and people are expected to be loyal to the queen. She can then choose who she wants to rule and gives positions of power to wealthy people, wealthy nobles. And you can take away positions if they upset her. You can see how this hierarchy works throughout Elizabethan society. One problem with patronage is this idea of factional rivalries, so that groups can break off and sort of fight against each other, so these small groups of courtiers. So looking at the court then, important definition of the royal court. The court travelled with the monarch. The court wasn't a place. It was a group of nobles and the gentry, so the wealthy landowners, who were favoured by the monarch and surrounded Elizabeth. So they went where Elizabeth went. So they met where she was staying. The main palace was at Whitehall, and she could decide which nobles could join her at court. So we'll often see the word courtier, so that's a member of the court. And when the court did meet at the palaces or wherever she was, they would dance, they'd enjoy plays, musicals, tournaments. Elizabeth was highly educated. She knew lots of different languages, and she used this to impress her nobles. Hundreds attended the court, but only a couple of them who she really liked got real power. They'd have to catch the Queen's eye to be able to get to be in favour, and then when a noble was in favour, they could build networks, keep land, but they might actually seek patronage from someone else if they were out of favour. So she did try and keep the support of everyone. So she could choose who was obviously in this court, and even though she was Protestant, she allowed some Catholic nobles to attend court. She didn't want there to be sort of strong groups against her and have lots of opposition. The Privy Chamber, so this was at the heart of the court. She'd spend a lot of time in a Privy Chamber talking, reading, playing music, etc. And she had her ladies in waiting looking after her. Only her most trusted courtiers were invited to discuss business. Sometimes she would conduct the business from her private chamber, her Privy Chamber. You can see in the picture some of the men behind her belong to a small group of advisors. So the Privy Council was the small group of advisors that were the closest to the Queen, and they met almost every day. Elizabeth only had 19 members of her Privy Council that she selected rather than allowing them to be elected. And they would discuss matters such as finance, trade, law enforcement. Councillors would often have different viewpoints, so she could then decide based on what they wanted to happen, or any laws that they wanted to introduce. She could decide based off of those. She'd often show a temper for no reason to sort of exert her control. She could dismiss people if they offended her. She encouraged loyalty through patronage, as we mentioned before. And she refused to marry Robert Dudley, who was a leading member of the Privy Council. So this is how she tried to avoid problems that previous Tudor monarchs had when certain councillors got too much power. So she wanted to control that. So the Secretaries of State organised the work of the Privy Council, so extremely important. We can sort of look at how Elizabeth used her power by looking at her Secretaries of State. So we've got Sir Francis Walsingham and Sir William Cecil. So William Cecil was Secretary of State from 1558 to 72, and then again from 1590 to 98, and Walsingham 1572 to 1590. So Walsingham was well educated. He was a Puritan, which is an extreme Protestant or a committed Protestant. He was quite cold and distant, and always sort of saw himself as a servant of the state, not a servant of the Queen. But Elizabeth did admire him and valued how loyal he was. And when I mentioned before about the anger and the temper, it was Walsingham that she threw a slipper at when he criticised her, and he actually died from exhaustion. Cecil was also a well-educated lawyer, a moderate Protestant, so not as extreme, but he did often favour the Puritans. Elizabeth called him her spirit, so she was extremely fond of him. He was never a yes man, and she trusted him more than anyone else. And again, he died of exhaustion as well. So both came from gentry families, and Elizabeth did believe that sort of the highly educated gentry were better at the day-to-day government than the nobles. So 1590s for Elizabeth was an extremely challenging decade, and both of her closest advisors died. The country is facing harvest, famine, so there's not enough food, plague and poverty, wars with Spain, as we'll see when we look at religion. She's not got an heir to the throne, she's unmarried, and she's becoming less popular. And this sort of comes to a point with the rebellion of the Earl of Essex. So he was one of Elizabeth's closest and favourite courtiers, but he defied Elizabeth by joining Sir Francis Drake's failed attack on Lisbon. And again, he married without her permission, so he's constantly seems to be going against her. When Secretary of State Cecil died, she made Robert, Cecil's son, Secretary of State, and Essex was very jealous of this because this is the job that he wanted. So she sent Essex to Ireland to try and defeat a Catholic rebellion. But instead of actually doing this, Essex made a truce, which was not what he was supposed to do. Elizabeth was furious, so banned him from court in 1600, took away his government job. So this patronage that she granted him, she sort of stopped that. And Essex rebelled in 1601. However, there was too much support for Elizabeth. It didn't work, and he was arrested and executed. So again, Elizabeth being able to show her power and that she still has some popularity. So our next section of Elizabeth and her power is Elizabeth and her Parliament. So Parliament was composed of 3 different elements. So as you can see in the picture at the top, you can see the monarch sat there. You've got the House of Lords with the nobles and the bishops, and the House of Commons, so the members of the gentry who'd been selected. Again, selected, not elected. So for most of her business, Elizabeth ruled by these royal proclamations. So these were royal orders that had the force of the law. And if she wanted to make any changes, Parliament had to meet to give her the approval. In Parliament, there were very strict limits on what could be discussed. So people were not allowed to discuss marriage, religion, succession, so who would be next in line to the throne, or foreign policy. So very sort of controlled on what people were allowed to discuss. To keep control of Parliament, again, MPs were selected. Privy Councillors served as MPs. In the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, and the Privy Council organised the daily business. If MPs didn't do as she wished, she could always just reject the law, but she often would offer a compromise so that these members of Parliament were getting some of what they wanted, but she still got the taxes and the laws that she needed. Now, I mentioned before with Walsingham how he was a Puritan and how Cecil did sort of favour the Puritans despite being a moderate Protestant, but there was lots of Puritan opposition, so it was still difficult to discuss, to stop MPs discussing sensitive matters Cecil Walsingham as Secretaries of State and the closest people to Elizabeth still did stir up debates. So the Puritans were her most troublesome critics. So she wanted to marry a Protestant prince. The Puritans wanted Elizabeth to marry a Protestant prince, wanted her to make changes to the way the church was organised and have freedom of speech. Now, John Stubbs in November 1579 wrote a pamphlet that criticised Elizabeth. He was arrested and had his right hand cut off. So we can see here that despite her maybe having less control over the Puritans and them still giving their saying their beliefs and sort of having this freedom of speech, she was still in control when it came to people criticising her. So one thing about the Puritans, that they never wanted to replace Elizabeth with another monarch, but the Catholics did. So you can see that she's facing some problems from the Puritans, but definitely problems from the Catholics. So parliamentary business, so between 1580 and 1603, there's lots of problems with Spain. Parliament needs to be called more often, and in turn there's lots more opposition. So opposition over religion. We've obviously got the Puritan MPs. They are, as we've said before, the various different things that they wanted. They wanted her to marry a Protestant prince and make sure that they are changing the way the church runs. And they wanted to get rid of bishops, but Elizabeth didn't want this discussion to go ahead. Two Puritans had actually been hanged for spreading these views, and an example is Peter Wentworth urging Elizabeth to name a Protestant successor, and he was imprisoned, so she should have some control. Opposition over money. So monopolies are when people had the sole right to buy and sell goods, so the sole right to trade, and MPs were unhappy with how Elizabeth granted these monopolies to keep the courtiers happy. So they would be the only person that could sell or make a product without competition. No one else was allowed to, so the prices went up. In 1601, she did accept that she needed to cancel the monopolies, and in her famous golden speech, she flattered MPs and it was about how much she loved her people to try and sort of reduce the opposition and gain people's affection again. Finally, we've got Elizabeth and her people. So local governments, we've got two different roles. So she needs other people to help control other areas of the kingdom. So you've got Lords Lieutenant and Justices of the Peace. Lords Lieutenant had responsibility for each county. There would be one in each county, and they were usually the most powerful noblemen. Justices of the Peace, however, there were 40 in each county. They would keep society running smoothly, enforced poor laws, collected taxes, etc. They would judge certain crimes like assault and burglary. And because there's no police, local and national government rely on public punishments. So this is the way Elizabeth is allowing local government to take some control and allow her to control her kingdom, where she's got 3 million people to control. So she needs some help with the local government. Propaganda and censorship, so these sort of powers of persuasion. She wanted to be seen as a strong ruler, and she used two approaches. So propaganda, she wanted to promote a positive image of herself, and censorship, she controlled the spread of other conflicting views. So propaganda is the positive and getting the positive image out there, and censorship is making sure that the negative conflicting views are restricted and not published. So we've got to our 8 P's of propaganda. We've got progresses, which were royal tours, so being seen by lots of different people and making good lasting impression. Publications, so anything that was published through the printing presses. It was easy for the Privy Council to censor them because there weren't many printing presses. There were never more than 60 in England, so it was easy for them to censor, publish their own books. Pennies. This is how most people gained an impression. It wasn't the most flattering picture, but she was on the halfpenny coin, so they could see her on that, and that's giving the impression of Elizabeth. Prayers, so prayers for the Queen's Majesty. Everyone's got to say that prayer, and everyone's got to attend church and use the same prayer book. Pageants, so Accession Day, so to remember the day when Elizabeth took the throne, would take place on the 17th of November. So again, to promote this positive image of the monarchy and of Elizabeth. We've got performances and plays, so they showed how kings and queens gave society order, so again promoting the position of the monarch. If the Queen did like this play, then they'd print it and have that in print and spread them round. But that she did shut down theatres in 1597 when a play criticised the Queen. Paintings, so she only had 2 artists. They'd make her look younger. So as we saw in the first painting, white clothing for strength. She'd often be pictured with a globe to show her power. And finally, preaching. Services of Thanksgiving on Accession Day, sermons, prayers, songs, again promoting the positive image of Elizabeth and sort of censoring any other conflicting views.